I need you to stop whatever you are doing right now and listen to me, because I'm about to tell you something that happened to me on a Tuesday night in October, and by the time I am finished telling it, you are going to understand why I slept with every single light in my apartment on for the next 3 months, why I stopped visiting my grandmother's grave for over a year, and why, to this day, if I am ever driving past a cemetery after dark, I do not look through the fence. I do not look at the headstones. I keep my eyes on the road and I keep driving and I do not stop. What I heard in that cemetery and what I eventually found when I followed the sound changed something in me permanently. Not dramatically, not in a way that shows on the outside, but there is a version of me that existed before that October night and a version that exists after it, and those two versions are not the same person. Tonight I am going to tell you exactly what happened, from the beginning in full detail, and I need you to stay with me until the very end because the part that will truly get under your skin is not the part you are expecting. It is the very last thing I found, and once I tell you what it was, you will understand why I could not go back. My name is Raymond. I am 36 years old, born and raised in a mid-sized city in the southeast, and for 11 months I worked as an armed security guard assigned to a cemetery in a neighborhood that had, over the preceding decade, become one of the higher crime areas in the city. I want to be honest about the context because it matters. This was not a small country churchyard. This was a large, municipal cemetery, established in the late 1800s, covering approximately 40 acres, with somewhere north of 12,000 individual burials ranging from modest flat markers to large family mausoleums. It was bordered on its north side by a commercial strip that had seen better decades, on its east side by a residential neighborhood with a complicated relationship with law enforcement, on its south side by a highway, and on its west side by a city park that closed at dusk and was, after dusk, reliably occupied by people who had nowhere else to go and nothing particularly good to do. The cemetery itself was surrounded by an 8-foot wrought iron fence, locked at the main gates from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and it was my job, along with one other guard named Terrence who worked the early shift and handed off to me at 11 p.m., to make sure that the locked gates and the fence actually meant something. The job existed because of a problem that sounds almost absurd until you understand the specifics. Vandalism was a significant part of it. Headstones get knocked over. Mausoleums get broken into. Spray paint. In the last few years before I took the job, there had been 2 incidents of grave robbery, attempts to steal items left by families on grave markers, jewelry, decorations, things of sentimental value that people leave for their dead. There had also been, and this was the part of the briefing that settled into my chest like a cold stone when my supervisor described it, there had been 2 documented incidents of digging, not by any official maintenance crew, not by the ground staff, unauthorized digging at night that had been discovered in the morning, incomplete, stopped before reaching any casket but clearly intentional and clearly targeted at specific recent burials. Nobody had been caught. Nobody had been charged. The digging had stopped before I started, or at least no new incidents had been discovered since the security contract was increased to include an overnight guard. That was, according to my supervisor, partly why the position existed. So when I took the job, I knew, going in, that I was guarding against the possibility of someone trying to dig up graves at night. I knew that was a real, documented possibility in this specific place. I want to be clear about that because it affects how you understand everything that followed. When I first heard the sound, I did not immediately think supernatural. I thought criminal. I thought I need to find this person and I need to call the police. That was my first response. That was the trained response. And I want you to hold on to that, because the story I am about to tell you is a story about a person who started out doing exactly the right rational professional thing and arrived, step by step, at something that no training and no rationality and no professional protocol had prepared him for in any way whatsoever. The rules for the job were straightforward on paper. I had a specific patrol route, a walking path that looped through the entire cemetery in a roughly figure-8 pattern, hitting all 40 acres over the course of about 50 minutes per full circuit. I was to complete this loop continuously throughout my shift, with a 30-minute break allowed at 2 a.m. at the guard booth near the main gate. I was armed, a standard sidearm, and I was required to have my radio on at all times and to check in with the monitoring center every 2 hours. If I observed any unauthorized persons on the grounds, I was to radio for police backup before approaching. Under no circumstances was I to confront an armed individual without police backup present. Standard stuff, professional stuff. I had been doing security work for 6 years before this assignment, shopping centers, parking structures, private events, and I was comfortable with the protocols. The cemetery at night was something I had to get used to. I want to be honest about that too. The first 2 weeks, every patrol loop left me with a residual unease that I had to consciously shake off before the next loop. Not because of anything that happened, just because of what the place was. 40 acres of dead, 12,000 individual graves. The old section in the northwest corner where the headstones were so weathered the names had been erased by time, and the markers leaned at angles like crooked teeth. The large Hargrove family mausoleum in the center of the grounds, a gray stone structure with an iron door and relief carvings of weeping figures that in my flashlight beam at 3 in the morning looked disturbingly mobile. The newer section in the southeast, where the grass was always freshest and the flowers left by recent mourners were still bright in the beam of my flashlight during the first few days after a burial and then faded and then gone. I got used to it. I made myself get used to it. By the end of the second week, it was a job. Just a job. Just a very large, very quiet, very dark outdoor space that I walked through every night and kept an eye on. October came. The trees in the cemetery were old, large hardwoods that the grounds crew had planted and maintained for generations. And in October they turned, and then the leaves came down, and the sound of the wind through them at night was something I grew to watch for because it changed the acoustic environment of the grounds significantly. More ambient noise, more rustling, more of that continuous low movement of air through dry leaves that creates a near-constant soft hiss that makes it harder to isolate specific sounds. This matters. This matters a lot. The night it happened was October 14th. I know the date precisely because I have the incident report I filed afterward. October 14th, a Tuesday. I came on shift at 11 p.m. Terrence briefed me that the grounds were clear. He'd done 2 loops without incident. I signed in. I started my first patrol at 11:15. The temperature was around 50 degrees, clear sky, about 3/4 of a moon that gave the grounds more ambient light than usual, which I appreciated. First loop was uneventful. Second loop uneventful. I took my break at 2 a.m., had coffee, did my check-in, went back out at 2:30 for my third loop. I was in the northwest section, the old part of the cemetery, the section with the leaning markers and the eroded names, at approximately 3:10 a.m. I know this timing from the incident report. I was moving along the path that curved through the northwest quadrant, my flashlight sweeping the rows of markers on either side, and I heard it, digging, not distant, not ambiguous. Close, maybe 40 or 50 yards to my north in the direction of the oldest section of the grounds, the area near the original cemetery boundary where the earliest burials dated back to the 1860s. The sound was unmistakable. A rhythmic, wet sound metal on earth, the specific cadence of a spade or shovel being driven into soil and turned. I had grown up in a house with a garden. I had dug plenty of holes in my life. I knew that sound. It was digging. Someone was digging in this cemetery at 3:10 in the morning. I stopped. I turned off my flashlight. I stood in the dark and I listened to confirm. Still there. The rhythm was steady, patient, working. I got on my radio immediately. I whispered to the monitoring center that I had a possible dig-in-progress situation, northwest quadrant, old section, requesting police backup. I would hold position until backup arrived. The monitoring center acknowledged and told me units were being dispatched, estimated arrival 12 to 15 minutes. I confirmed I would hold position. I held position for 4 minutes. The digging continued. I want to tell you that I stood there in the dark for 4 minutes, listening to someone dig in a cemetery in the middle of the night, and that 4 minutes is a very long time when that is what you are listening to. I kept the flashlight off. I moved slowly toward the sound, keeping to the grass rather than the path, moving as quietly as I could, using the headstones as partial cover, trying to get close enough to see without being seen. Protocol said wait for backup. Protocol was very clear. But I was also responsible for these grounds, and whoever was digging had a 4-minute head start while I waited. And if they were disturbing a burial, I felt professionally and honestly humanly obligated to at least see them clearly enough to describe them to police. I got to within what I estimated was 20 yards of the sound. I crouched behind a large granite marker, an obelisk-type stone, and I listened. The digging was clearly on the other side of a slight rise in the ground, the low natural hill that marked the original boundary of the cemetery before it was expanded in the 1920s. I could not see the person digging. I could only hear them. The sound was completely steady. No pause, no break, no variation in rhythm, just patient, continuous digging at 3 in the morning in the dark. And then I noticed something that made the hair on my arm stand up under my jacket sleeve. There was no light. I had been looking for it as I moved closer because anyone digging in a cemetery at 3 in the morning would need light to see what they were doing. You can't dig accurately in the dark. You need a flashlight, a headlamp, a lantern, something. The moon was 3/4 full and providing reasonable ambient light, but not enough to work by in any precise way. I was crouched 20 yards from this sound, and the area beyond the rise was clearly visible in the moonlight, and there was no additional light source. No flashlight beam moving. No headlamp glow. Just the moonlight on the old headstones and the black earth and the sound of digging. Police arrived in 11 minutes. 2 officers. I met them at the North Path and briefed them quickly, told them the sound was still ongoing, described the location. We moved in together, 3 of us, flashlights on, coming over the rise as a group. We had our lights on the area before whoever was there could have had time to run. There was nobody there. The digging sound stopped the moment our flashlights cleared the rise, not gradually, immediately. The moment the beams hit the area, complete silence, and the area appeared to be undisturbed. Old grass, old markers, no fresh turned earth, no hole in progress, no tool left behind. No footprints in the soft October soil that I could see with my light. Nothing. The officers looked around for about 15 minutes. They were professional and thorough, and they found nothing. One of them said it might have been an animal, something burrowing. I said it was a shovel. He nodded in a way that meant he didn't particularly believe me but wasn't going to argue. They filed a report noting a sound complaint, no evidence of disturbance found. They left at 3:40 a.m. I finished my shift. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning. He was quieter than usual when I described it. He asked if I had followed protocol. I said yes. He said okay. He paused for a long time and then he said, "Did you check the Pemberton plot?" I didn't know what the Pemberton plot was. He told me it was a family section in the far northwest corner, beyond the rise, the oldest section. He said there had been anomalous reports from that section before I was hired, reports from the previous guard, nothing specific enough to document formally, just notes in the handover log. He said to be aware of that area. I asked what kind of anomalous reports. He said sound reports, digging sounds. I asked when. He said on and off for the last 2 years. I asked if anyone had ever found evidence of actual digging. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not at the Pemberton plot. I want you to sit with that answer for a second. Not at the Pemberton plot, which meant there had been evidence of digging somewhere else in the cemetery during those 2 years, but not there. The sound had been coming from the Pemberton plot consistently for 2 years, and no physical evidence had ever been found there. And somewhere else in the cemetery, there had been physical evidence of digging, unexplained, the incidents I had been briefed about when I was hired. 2 incidents, 2 patches of disturbed earth over recent graves that had been found in the morning with no explanation for how they got there. I did some research on the Pemberton family when I got home that day. It wasn't hard. Local Historical Society website had records. The Pembertons were one of the original families who had donated the land for the cemetery in the 1860s. The family section in the northwest corner contained the earliest burials on the grounds, and the Pemberton family, according to the historical record, had a specific and documented reason for choosing to establish a cemetery on their land in 1863. The reason was that 2 of their children had been buried informally on the property in the 1850s, before any official cemetery was established, in a section of the family land that was already being used informally by several local families for burials, and the Pembertons had wanted those informal graves properly marked and protected. 2 children, buried informally. In the 1850s, I went back that night. I went back every night for 10.5 more months. The digging sound came back 4 more times, always in the northwest section, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always with no physical evidence afterward, always stopping immediately when I moved close with a light. The 5th time, the last time I heard it, it was late August, 9 months after the October incident, and by that point I knew the sound well, knew its rhythm and its pace and its patient, steady quality. I had talked to Terrence about it, and he had heard it too twice in the year before I arrived, and he had the same story I did. Sound stops. Nothing found. No light source visible. No person visible. Just the sound. The last time I heard it on that August night, I did something I had not done any of the previous 4 times. Instead of moving toward it, I moved around it. I took the long way around the northwest section, circled wide, came at the area from the north side, from outside the original cemetery boundary, approaching through the overgrowth along the fence line rather than through the path. It took me longer, maybe 12 minutes, but when I came over the low boundary ridge from the north side, coming in from behind the area where the sound had been coming from, the sound was still going, and I was coming at it from a direction it hadn't been coming from before. I got within 10 yards, still no light, still that steady, patient rhythm, and I still could not see anyone. But from this angle from the north side, I could see the Pemberton plot markers, and I could see in the moonlight the ground between 2 of the oldest markers in that section. And the ground between those 2 markers was moving, not dramatically, not obviously, but the surface of the earth between those 2 stones was shifting, slowly. From beneath, I put my flashlight on it. The movement stopped. The sound stopped. The ground was still. I stood there with my flashlight on that patch of earth for a very long time. I quit 2 weeks later. I put in my notice, gave the standard 2 weeks, finished my remaining shifts without incident. I have not been back to that cemetery. I have not visited any cemetery after dark. I know what the Pemberton family records say about 2 children buried informally in the 1850s. I know that the ground between those 2 markers is the oldest ground in that cemetery. I know that the sound has been heard for at least 2 years by at least 2 guards. And I know that the earth between those stones moves when the sound is happening and stops when the light finds it. And I know that there are 12,000 burials in that cemetery. And I know that only 2 of them are in that particular spot. And they have been there for over 160 years. And sometimes at 3 in the morning on certain nights, in the oldest section, in the dark, in the place where the names on the stones have been worn away by time until they are almost unreadable, something beneath that ground is still trying to get out. Story number 2. There is a smell that is specific to a place where human beings have suffered for a very long time. And if you have ever been in such a place, even during the day, even with other people around, even decades after the suffering ended, you know what I mean when I say that it does not leave. It soaks into the walls. It soaks into the floors. It becomes part of the air of the building in a way that no amount of time and no amount of disuse and no amount of weather getting in through broken windows fully disperses. It is a smell that is partly chemical, old antiseptic, old institutional cleaning products, the particular formaldehyde-adjacent quality of places where medicine was practiced in eras before better options existed. And it is partly something else. Something organic and old and deeply human that I have no clinical name for, but that every single person who has ever walked alone through an abandoned building where people once lived against their will has identified immediately upon entering. It is the smell of prolonged confinement. It is the smell of a place that remembers what happened inside it. I know that smell intimately. I worked inside it for 7 months. And I am going to tell you tonight about the night shift at Harlow Psychiatric Institute, which closed its doors to patients in 1991, and which I was assigned to guard alone, starting at midnight and ending at 8 a.m. for 214 nights. I am going to tell you what walked those halls with me, and I am going to tell you about what was in room 47. My name is Victor. I am 43 years old. I live now in a city I am not going to name because I moved specifically to start over after what happened, and I have worked deliberately to establish a life that has nothing in it that reminds me of that building. I have largely succeeded, mostly. Except at night, when the particular quality of darkness in a room sometimes catches me the wrong way, and for a fraction of a second, the dark has that weight and that smell, and the sound of feet on linoleum that no longer exists, but that I still hear sometimes the way you still hear a sound after the source has stopped. I'm going to tell you everything. Harlow Psychiatric Institute was established in 1912 on a property outside the city, a large red brick complex originally built as a tuberculosis sanatorium that was repurposed in the early part of the 20th century as the region grew and the need for institutional psychiatric care expanded. At its peak operational capacity in the 1950s and 60s, Harlow housed approximately 400 patients. Its history, like the history of most large-scale psychiatric institutions of that era, was not a simple story. There were periods of genuine care and professional treatment. There were also documented periods of practices that, by any modern standard, were abusive, forced procedures, overcrowding, inadequate staffing, the kinds of conditions that end up in historical investigations and documentary films decades later when the files are finally opened. By the time Harlow closed in 1991, it had been housing around 120 patients under a dramatically reduced staff, and the closure was not voluntary. It was ordered by the state following an inspection report that described conditions, the report characterized as inconsistent with basic standards of human dignity. The remaining patients were transferred to other facilities. The building was locked, and for more than 30 years it sat. It sat because the property was caught in a legal and financial situation that is common to large decommissioned institutional properties. The building was owned by the state. The state did not want to pay for demolition. A series of developers over the years expressed interest in converting it to residential or commercial use, and then quietly withdrew that interest upon closer inspection of the structural and environmental assessment reports. There were asbestos issues. There were structural concerns in the older wings. There was the matter of the burial ground on the southwest corner of the property, where Harlow patients who had died on the grounds with no family to claim them had been interred since the 1920s. You cannot just demolish around a burial ground. It adds cost and complication. So the building sat, and the state paid a facilities management company a modest ongoing contract to maintain minimum security of the property, prevent unauthorized access, prevent copper theft and the kind of structural vandalism that accelerates deterioration, and report any significant issues. That contract was held by the company I worked for. That is how I ended up there. I was given a tour of the building on my first day by the regional facilities manager, a brisk, efficient woman named Sandra who walked quickly and spoke factually, and answered my questions without elaboration. The building was 5 stories in the main structure, with 2 additional wings extending from the back, the east wing and the west wing, which were 3 stories each. The main structure had held administration, medical offices, a cafeteria, a chapel, and a common area on the ground floor, with patient wards on the upper 4 floors. The east wing had been the more acute care ward, the one where patients requiring the most supervision and the most intensive treatment had been housed. The west wing had been described in its operational era as the therapeutic wing, which Sandra said with the particular neutral intonation of a person who has learned to present information without editorializing. My job was to walk the building, all of it. A full patrol of the entire structure, every floor, every corridor, every accessible room, once per shift, with a check-in at every floor using the electronic wand system, the kind where you touch a wand to a checkpoint reader mounted on the wall, and it logs your presence and your time. The building had 32 checkpoint readers. I was required to hit all 32, which meant physically standing in front of every checkpoint, every night, including the ones on the upper floors of the East Wing, including the one at the end of the 4th floor East Wing corridor, which was the corridor where most of the single-occupancy rooms had been, the rooms where the most severely affected patients had been kept, and which was the corridor that contained room 47. I want to talk about the building sounds before I talk about room 47, because the sounds are part of the story. An old brick institutional building that has been unoccupied for over 30 years produces an enormous range of sounds. The structure settles. The pipes, which still carried water for the fire suppression system, occasionally ticked and groaned with temperature changes. The wind got in through broken windows in the upper floors and moved through the corridors in ways that produced drafts, whistles, the slow grinding pressure of air moving through spaces not designed for airflow. Birds had nested in parts of the roof structure. Rodents. A building of that size, that age, that level of disuse is never fully silent. It is constantly making sounds. Small sounds and medium sounds, and occasionally sounds that stopped me cold in the middle of a corridor with my flashlight pointing at an empty doorway, until I talked myself through the physical explanation for what I had just heard. I was good at the physical explanations. I had worked other vacant building security assignments before Harlow, a decommissioned factory, an old hotel undergoing renovation that I guarded during the off hours, a warehouse complex. I knew the vocabulary of empty buildings at night. I was not a person who spooked easily, and I want to be clear about that because I do not want you to think that what I experienced at Harlow was the product of an overactive imagination or a general susceptibility to being frightened. I was not frightened easily. I was frightened at Harlow. The smell hit me every night when I entered, every single night. You would think a person would acclimate to a smell after 200 plus nights of exposure. The smell at Harlow did not permit acclimation. Every night, coming through the main entrance, the smell was there, immediate and specific and overwhelming in the way that very specific smells are overwhelming, antiseptic and organic and old and deeply wrong in a way I could never fully articulate but could never fail to recognize. I started chewing gum during my shifts, not because it helped, but because having something in my mouth gave my brain a competing sensory input to focus on. It helped a little, not much. The first unusual thing I noticed at Harlow was in my second week. I was doing my patrol on the third floor of the main building, the patient ward floor, walking the central corridor with my flashlight. The rooms on this floor had been stripped of everything. Beds gone, furniture gone, the mattresses and the personal effects of patients gone when the facility closed. The rooms empty except for the marks on the walls and floors that decades of occupation leave. Scuff marks on the baseboards. The rectangular shadows on the floor where beds had stood for decades. The dark rectangles on the walls where the paint behind pictures or wall-mounted fixtures had been protected from the slow yellowing of the rest of the surface. I had walked this corridor 8 or 9 times by that point. I knew it. On this particular night, I was about 2/3 of the way down the corridor when my flashlight picked up something in the doorway of one of the rooms on my left. The door had been removed. All the interior doors had been removed during the clear-out, so the doorway was an open rectangle of darkness. In that rectangle, at approximately the height where a person's upper body would be if they were standing just inside the room, my flashlight caught a reflection. Just for a moment, just as my beam swept past, a dull, flat reflection like light catching a surface that wasn't quite smooth, wasn't quite mirror-like, somewhere between the two. I stopped. I brought the beam back. Nothing in the doorway, empty rectangle of dark. I went into the room, empty. Floor to ceiling, completely empty room. I told myself it was a piece of glass on the floor that I was seeing at an angle, though I couldn't find any glass when I checked the floor. I moved on, finished the corridor, finished the floor. It happened again the next night. Different corridor, second floor main building. Same thing. Flashlight sweeping, a brief dull flat reflection at head height from an empty doorway, gone when I stopped and looked directly at it. The night after that, same thing, east wing first floor. Over the next 3 weeks it happened 11 times on various floors. Always a brief reflection at head height from empty doorways. Always in my peripheral vision, always gone when I looked directly at it. Always in doorways where rooms were empty. I tried to explain it. Changed the angle of my flashlight sweep. Tried different speeds. Checked the floors and walls of every room it happened near for glass, for reflective materials, for any surface that could produce the effect I was seeing. Found nothing that explained it. The reflections continued. I logged them in my personal notes because I had developed the habit of keeping my own notes separate from the official incident reports, and logging something felt better than not logging it even when I didn't know what I was logging. The first time something happened in a doorway that was not a reflection was on a Thursday in my 5th week. I was on the 4th floor of the East Wing, the single occupancy rooms. The checkpoint at the end of this corridor was the last checkpoint on my route before I headed back down to the ground floor, and I always felt a specific quality of relief when I tagged it and could turn around. The rooms on this corridor were different from the rooms in the main building. They were smaller, and some of them still had the external locks on the door frames, the heavy sliding bolt locks that could only be operated from outside the room, and the small observation windows in the door frames where the doors had been, rectangles of thick glass about 6 inches by 8 inches set into the frame at eye height. The doors were gone, but the frame hardware remained and the observation windows remained, and walking this corridor at night, passing those rectangular pieces of thick glass set into those frames at eye height, was the specific part of my patrol that I had the hardest time with from the very beginning. I was 3 doors from the end of the corridor, moving toward the checkpoint, when I saw something in one of the observation windows, through the glass, on the other side. I want to be very precise. I could see through the observation windows. They were thick glass but transparent enough that my flashlight, shining down the corridor, produced enough ambient light to see through them into the rooms. Through this particular window, I saw a shape, a dark shape, positioned in the room on the other side of the glass, at the height where a face would be if a person were standing at the window looking out. I stopped. I pointed my flashlight directly at the window. The shape did not disappear the way the doorway reflections disappeared. Dark, head height still, I stood in that corridor pointing my flashlight at that observation window for what I believe was approximately 45 seconds. The shape remained. I walked toward it 6 steps, 5, 4. The shape was still there, 3 steps, 2, I was at the door frame. I held my flashlight up to the observation window and looked through it. Empty room, floor, walls. A single iron ring mounted on the far wall that I always tried not to look at directly. Nothing else. Empty. I went back to my position 3 doors back and looked down the corridor at the window again. Nothing. Just glass. I went home that morning and I looked up the history of Harlow in more detail than Sandra had provided during the tour. I found the state inspection report from 1991 that had led to the closure. I read it. It was a thorough document. It described, in the dispassionate language of bureaucratic reporting, conditions on each ward. The East Wing 4th floor was described in language that I am going to paraphrase rather than quote, because even paraphrasing, it makes me feel a particular way. The report described patients on that ward as having been in some cases in single-occupancy rooms with very limited access to communal areas, in some cases for periods described as extended. It described the observation of several patients during the inspection in postures the report characterized as consistent with long-term occupancy of small enclosed spaces. I knew what that meant. I knew what long-term occupancy of a small enclosed space does to a person's posture and a person's habits and a person's relationship to windows and doors. I had read enough history to know. I went back the next night, and the night after that, I kept going back. For 7 months, I walked those corridors and I did my checkpoints, and I came home in the morning and I slept and I went back. Room 47 was on the 4th floor east wing. I knew which room it was because the room numbers were still stenciled on the wall beside the door frames, black paint, institutional font, most of them still legible despite 30 years. Room 47 was the 3rd room from the end of the corridor, on the right side. I had passed it every single patrol, every single night for months. I had shown my light through its observation window on multiple occasions. Empty room, iron ring on the far wall, same as the others. The night that room 47 was different was in my 6th month. A February night when the temperature outside was below freezing, and the building's pipes were louder than usual with the cold, and the wind was getting through the upper floor windows in a way that produced a continuous low moan I had gotten used to, but that was, on this particular night, subtly different in pitch and rhythm from what I normally heard. I noticed the difference, but I attributed it to the specific wind conditions and temperature differential, and I moved through my patrol without dwelling on it. I was on the fourth floor east wing, moving toward the checkpoint. I reached room 47. I shone my light through the observation window out of habit. The room was not empty. There was a chair in it. A wooden chair, the institutional type, plain and heavy with flat surfaces, the kind of chair that would have been in every common room of a facility like this in the 1940s and 50s. It was positioned in the center of the room, facing the door. I had not seen this chair in this room on any previous night. I had shone my light through this window dozens of times. There had been no chair. There was now. I stood at that window for a long time. The chair was real, physical, solid. It was not a reflection or a trick of the light. It was a wooden chair sitting in the center of a room that had been empty the last time I checked it, facing the door. I radioed my monitoring center and told them I had observed furniture in a room that should have been empty, possible unauthorized entry. They acknowledged and said they would note it. They did not send anyone. I unlocked the door to the east wing. The east wing doors were locked between patrol levels. I went into room 47. I examined the chair. It was real. It was solid. It was not dusty the way everything else in the building was dusty. It was clean. The chair was clean. In a room that had been sealed and unoccupied for over 30 years, there was a clean wooden chair sitting in the center of the floor facing the door. I left room 47. I completed my patrol. I filed a full incident report in the morning. I came back that night and the chair was still there. I came back the night after that and the chair was still there, but it had moved. Still in the center of the room, but it was now turned 15 degrees, so it was no longer facing directly at the door but slightly to the left of the door. Not dramatically, just slightly, like someone had been sitting in it and had shifted. I finished my remaining 3 weeks at Harlow after that. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, no single terrifying moment that sent me running. I just finished my notice period and I did not renew the contract. Every night in those final 3 weeks I did my checkpoint on the fourth floor east wing, and every night I shone my light through the window of room 47, and the chair was there, and it was in a slightly different position from the night before. Always in the center of the room, always slightly different from the night before. Twice, the chair was facing almost completely away from the door, toward the wall. Once, it was close to the wall, near the iron ring. By my last night, it had moved back to the center, facing the door, facing the window, facing me. I do not know what moved the chair. I do not know what was in room 47. I know the history of that floor, and I know what the inspection report said. And I know that the building remembers what happened in it. And I know that something in that building made sounds in empty doorways and showed itself briefly through observation windows and put a clean chair in a room that should have had nothing in it and moved that chair night by night by night while I was the only person in the building. I know the building is still there. I know it still has a security contract. I know someone is walking those corridors right now in this season in the cold dark, with their flashlight and their checkpoint wand and the smell in their throat that does not leave. And I know that on the fourth floor east wing, in the room with the iron ring on the wall, there is a clean wooden chair, and I know it is facing the door. And I know that if you look through that small rectangular window at the right moment, in the dark, with your flashlight catching the glass at just the wrong angle, you will see something on the other side looking back. Story number 3. I want you to think about eyes for a second. Just for a second. Think about what makes a pair of eyes wrong. Think about the specific quality of wrongness that your brain registers instantly and involuntarily when it sees eyes that are not right, not just in the dark, not just in your peripheral vision, but in direct view, clearly and fully visible, looking directly back at you. There is a very specific response your nervous system produces. It bypasses every cognitive process. It goes directly to the oldest part of your brain, the part that has been keeping human beings alive for hundreds of thousands of years by recognizing threat before the thinking brain has time to catch up. That part of your brain does not make mistakes. It does not produce false positives when it's really looking at something. It tells you what it sees, and it is correct. I know this because of what happened to me outside a production trailer on a street in Harlem at 3:20 in the morning, when a man walked out of the alley across the street and stood at the edge of the light and looked at me. And my nervous system told me immediately and completely and without any ambiguity whatsoever that the eyes looking at me from that face were not right. That is the story I am going to tell you tonight. Stay with me. My name is Deshaun. I am 34 years old. I grew up in the Bronx. I live now in Queens. And for 14 months I worked as a production security officer for a company that provided security services to film and television productions working in the New York metropolitan area. This is a real, specific, fairly specialized niche of the security industry. When a film or television show is shooting on location, particularly in urban areas where you have expensive equipment sitting outside in public spaces overnight, they hire security. My job was to guard the production, the equipment trailers, the camera boxes, the lighting rigs, the grip and electric trucks, all of it, during the hours when the crew had wrapped for the day and gone home, and the equipment was secured in place for the next day's shoot. I worked nights. I worked alone or sometimes with a partner, depending on the size of the production and the specific security requirements of each shoot. I worked all over the city, Midtown, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island, and frequently Harlem, which in the period I worked there was a neighborhood that was actively being used for production because of its visual character, its architecture, its streets and buildings that could stand in for many different periods and settings when dressed correctly. I loved the job for the first year. I am going to say that plainly because it is true and because it is important context. I was outdoors. I was moving around the city at night, which I had always preferred to day. The productions varied enough that no two assignments were quite the same. I met interesting people, crew members wrapping late and chatting before they left, neighbors who came out to see what was filming. I was good at the job. I was observant and I kept a calm disposition, and I could handle the occasional confrontational situation. A drunk person trying to sit on a camera case, someone trying to take pictures too close to the equipment, a theft attempt once in Brooklyn that I handled correctly and professionally. I was good at it, and I liked it, and then the Harlem job happened and something changed in how I experienced the dark in this city, and it has not changed back. The production was a television series. I'm not going to name the show, and I'm not going to name the network because I have no desire to cause any problems for anyone connected to it. It was shooting a block in central Harlem that had been dressed as a different decade. The production had been on that block for 6 days when I was assigned to the overnight. I was assigned solo. The equipment package was substantial. 2 40-foot trailers parked along the north side of the block, a grip truck, an electric truck, several camera and lens cases that had been secured in a locked tent beside the trailers, an assortment of production vehicles, a total equipment value that was significant enough that the production coordinator had been very specific with me about walk-around frequency and the specific items I needed to keep eyes on throughout the night. She had given me a checklist. I had followed checklists like it for a year. Standard. The block was quiet when the crew cleared at around 9:30 p.m. A few local residents were out for a while after that, people walking dogs, A couple of guys sitting on a stoop a few doors down who watched me with the particular evaluative attention that people pay to unfamiliar presences in their neighborhood, which I respected and understood. By 11 p.m., the block was mostly quiet. By midnight, it was very quiet. I had done my first 2 walk-arounds without incident. I was set up in a folding chair near the forward trailer, which was my base position, with sight lines to most of the equipment and a clear view of both ends of the block. I had my radio, my phone, my flashlight. Standard equipment night. Nothing unusual. The alley was across the street, about 40 feet from where I was sitting. A service alley between 2 residential buildings. The kind of alley that runs through every city block in New York, wide enough for a delivery vehicle, dark enough that my flashlight didn't fully penetrate its depth when I occasionally swept it during my walk-arounds. The alley had a light fixture above its entrance, a standard overhead fixture, but the bulb was out, had been out for the duration of the shoot as far as I knew. So the alley entrance was dark, bordered on either side by the lit facades of the buildings around it. At 3:20 a.m., I saw movement at the alley entrance. I had seen movement there before on this shift, twice, both times raccoons, the urban wildlife that comes out in the deep hours of the city night and moves through alleys with the confident habitual ease of established residents. I looked. I swept my flashlight in that direction, and I saw that it was not a raccoon. A man was standing at the edge of the alley. He had walked out of the dark interior of the alley and stopped at the point where the alley ended and the sidewalk began, at the exact edge between the darkness inside the alley and the ambient streetlight of the block. He was standing completely still. He was facing directly toward me. I could see his face. The streetlight was enough for that. He was a tall man, I estimated over 6 feet, thin, wearing dark clothes, a jacket of some kind, and he was just standing there at the edge of the alley across the street looking at me. This was not immediately alarming. People walk in New York at 3 in the morning. People come out of alleys in New York. People stop and look at things, including security officers and production equipment. In a year of doing this job, I had been looked at, approached, had conversations with, or briefly monitored dozens of people on dozens of overnight assignments. Standing still and looking at me was not unusual. What was unusual was the eyes. From 40 feet in the ambient streetlight of the block, I could see his eyes. They were dark, very dark. The kind of dark that, from a distance in low light, looks like the eye is simply all pupil, no iris visible, all one dark color, no white. I told myself it was the distance and the light. I told myself I was seeing shadow playing across his face in a way that made his eyes look darker than they were. I kept my flashlight down. I watched him. He watched me. Neither of us moved 30 seconds, a minute. He did not move. He did not shift his weight. He did not look away, not once, not even the brief involuntary look away that people naturally do because no one stares directly at another person without blinking or shifting for a full minute. He was completely still, looking directly at me. I stood up from my chair. I kept my posture casual, not confrontational, not alarmed. I took a step to my left to change my position relative to the streetlight so that I was now in a slightly brighter spot, better lit, more visible. He tracked my movement. His head turned to follow me as I moved, still facing directly at me. I raised my flashlight and pointed it across the street at him, not aggressively, just the routine flashlight sweep I would do for anyone standing near production equipment at 3 in the morning. I swept the light over him. He did not react to the light, not at all. His face was fully lit by my flashlight beam, clearly and completely visible, and he did not blink, did not raise a hand, did not turn away from the light even slightly. People turn from a direct flashlight beam. Everybody turns. It's involuntary. He did not. and in my flashlight beam with his face fully lit, I could see his eyes clearly. They were dark, all of them, not just the pupils, not the iris, not the parts that should be dark, all of it. The entire visible eye, the whole sphere dark. No white, no distinction between iris and pupil, just dark. Both eyes, completely dark. I have been thinking about how to describe what happened in my body in the next 5 seconds since the night it happened. The best I can do is to tell you that every physical system I had produced an immediate and total alarm state, the kind that produces cold sweat and elevated heart rate, and the specific narrowing of focus that the human nervous system produces when it has decided that the thing in front of you is a direct threat to your continued existence. That response is not voluntary. You do not choose it. It chose me. My body decided on a level below any cognitive process that what I was looking at across that street was not safe, was deeply, completely, categorically not safe. He smiled, slowly. While I was pointing my flashlight at him, he smiled. The smile was wide. It was a very wide smile, too wide, the smile of something that is not concerned about being seen. The smile of something that is entirely comfortable being looked at directly while smiling a smile that wide because it knows there is nothing you can do about it and nowhere you can go that changes anything. I took out my radio. I called my monitoring center. I described what I was seeing. I said there was a man standing at the alley entrance across the street, that I was uncertain of his intentions. The monitoring center said they would note it and call police if I needed. I said hold for now. I did not take my eyes off him. He did not take his eyes off me. He was still smiling. For 17 minutes he stood there. I know it was 17 minutes because I was watching my phone's clock during this period with the specific intensity of a person who has decided that timing and documentation are the things they can control right now, and so those are the things they are going to focus on. 17 minutes. He did not move from that position. He did not look away. He smiled for approximately the first 4 of those 17 minutes, and then the smile faded and he just watched me again. Still as stone, eyes completely dark. At the 17-minute mark, a taxi came down the block, moving at normal speed, headlights on. It passed between me and the alley. The taxi took maybe 3 seconds to cross my line of sight. When it cleared, the alley entrance was empty. He was gone. In 3 seconds. In the time it took a cab to drive past. I walked across the street immediately. I looked into the alley with my flashlight. The alley went back about 60 feet to a door at the rear of one of the buildings. The alley was empty. The rear door was closed. There was no exit from the alley that I had not been watching. He had not come out either end of the alley during the 17 minutes he stood there. He had simply stepped back into the dark of the alley in the 3 seconds the cab blocked my view and disappeared. I finished the shift. I called the production coordinator in the morning and I told her I had an incident to report. I told her what I had seen. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Did he come near the equipment?" I said no. She said, "Was anything taken?" I said no. She said, "Well, that happens sometimes. We've had some strange situations on this block." I said, "Strange how?" She said, "I don't know. Some of the crew have mentioned feeling watched." She said it in the tone of a person talking about a slightly unusual but ultimately manageable production inconvenience. I said the eyes were completely dark. She was quiet. She said, "What do you mean?" I described it. She was quiet again for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll make a note of it. Stay alert tonight. There was one more night of the Harlem shoot." I went back. Nothing happened. The alley was empty the entire night. I walked the block every 90 minutes and I shone my flashlight into that alley entrance every single time, and it was empty every single time. I finished the shift at 6 a.m. and I went home in the early morning light, and I sat on my couch for a long time without doing anything, and I tried to find the explanation that fit all the facts. The distance was not enough to make normal eyes look like what I had seen. The flashlight beam had been direct and at close range and had fully illuminated his face. The non-reaction to the light was real and documented and physiologically impossible for a human being. The smile was real. The stillness was real. The 17 minutes was real. The 3-second disappearance into an alley with no exit was real. I could not find an explanation that fit all of those facts, and I have been trying for 2 years now, and I still cannot. I left that job 8 months later, not solely because of this incident, but partially because of it, because something changed in how I experienced the overnight hours in the city after that night. The city's dark became different to me. The alleys became different. I became aware of eyes in a way I had not been before. When I do the overnight walk now, in the job I have now, which is indoors and well lit, I find myself checking corners and doorways for eyes, for dark eyes, for the specific quality of absolute stillness that I saw across that street for 17 minutes. I have told this story twice before, to my older brother and to a close friend, and both times the person I was telling it to asked the same question at the end. They asked, "What do you think it was?" And I gave them both the same answer. I don't know what it was. I know what my nervous system said when I looked at it. I know what that oldest, deepest part of my brain told me, the part that has never in my life misfired, the part that knows the difference between something that is safe and something that is not. I know what it said, and I know that it was right. And I know that whatever was standing at the edge of that alley, smiling at me with those eyes, is still out there somewhere in this city, in some alley on some block, at some hour of the night when everyone else is asleep, and only the people who work in the dark are awake to see it. And I know it is looking at something, right now, tonight, with those eyes that never need to look away and that take the light directly without flinching. And whatever it is looking at right now, I hope with everything I have that it is not you.